start recording and
this is
get
YouTube
my
Live,
bearings.
not Podcast Live.
Yes. I mean, we're not live on YouTube yet.
No,
We're
this is just recording.
correct.
Oh, someone just said that the chat's disabled on YouTube. Is that true, or will people be able to comment while we're doing this?
You know, let me check with Jared. I feel like we've had chat enabled in the past, but I've noticed like it's disabled now.
Right.
So let me check in with Jared and just give me a second.
There's also a Slack community that we monitor usually. So if people want to comment or heckle.
Oh, I am live on YouTube. That's so funny. Here I am thinking, I didn't hit the live button though, Jared.
Wait,
Gosh.
We're there
We're
already?
still in preview. Oh, recording. Yes. Oh, okay, cool. We're already there, which is fine. Hello, internet. It's all good. We always have like pre-show time before on YouTube. YouTube is like the off the cuff, like people get to see how the sausage is made. So folks will see us in breaks. Folks will see us making jokes that don't ever get published. So anyways, so before we start, Rich, do you need like to use the restroom? Do you need some water? Take a break? You good?
I am all set.
Okay, so everyone's got their local recording started. Just reminder, like first segment, intros, origin story, some of the constraints around why Svelte was created. Amelia, just jump in wherever like you think it makes sense, and like this is just super organic. I'm gonna blame my very busy week.
And Jared posted a link in Slack, but probably for people on YouTube, they can't see it. So if they want to heckle us, they can go to jsparty.fm/community to sign up for Slack.
But no heckling.
Please.
All right. Yes. No. Please be kind, internet. All right. Cool. So I think we'll get started. Just pulling up the episode number for the last show that you were on. Can you believe that like 2019 was 3 years ago? It's crazy. Yeah. So
what?
January 30th, 2019 is almost 3 years ago. I mean, according to the internet, anyway. Okay. So I think it's episode number. I find this episode number. Oh, this is on changelog. That's why. Okay, forget it. I was looking for like a JS Party episode number. All right. Okay, so we can get started. Ready, everyone? 1, 2, 3. All right. I'll play the intro music. Hello, JS Party listeners. Welcome to a very, very special show today. I know I say this every week, and I know I say that every week, but like really, like I'm very excited about this show. We have a really special guest, but before we get to the guest, we're going to introduce my co-panelist, co-pilot for today, Amelia Wattenberger. Hello, welcome, Amelia.
Hey.
Amelia, is your name German? Just curious, because every time I say Wattenberger, I like have this urge to like go full German. I'm like, alles gut, yeah, Wattenberger. So is it German?
I actually looked this up a few days ago. My dad is really into genealogy, and he has our tree traced back to like the 1200s.
Wow.
But it comes from a German province called Württemberg, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's
very cool.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, my parents are Somali, and I can trace my lineage back like 27 ancestors or something like that as well. So it's crazy. But anyways, lineage aside, we're going to talk about someone who's really important to, I think, web lineage, web history, web herstory, Rich Harris. Welcome, Rich. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I don't even know how to introduce you anymore because I like, would say like, you're like that JavaScript engineer that like makes everything better, that happens to spend like, yeah, like who also kind of identifies as a journalist, right? You're an open sourcer, you're a teacher, you're an educator, creator, and now like kind of working on an open source full time. So can you, yeah, just tell us a little bit about yourself for folks who might not be familiar, and welcome.
Yeah, so I'm Rich. I work at Vercel. As of 3 weeks ago, I joined the company so that I work on Svelte full time. Svelte is a project that I've been developing for the last 5 years now. It has its fifth birthday this month. Actually, no, last month. It's now December. Man, time moves fast. Um, and prior to Vercel, I spent my entire career in newsrooms. I trained as a journalist, and then I worked in the interactive graphics departments of the Guardian and then the New York Times. Um, and I've done a little few bits of open source here and there along the way. Some people know me as the guy who did Rollup, the module bundler. They
Yeah.
curse my name every time they have to configure a Rollup project.
It's okay because Rich, you're only as good as the people who came before you. And I will say that roll up is certainly push the needle. So, but no, I mean, so I think it's really incredible, Rich. I feel like you've kind of gained this reputation, at least for me, as being someone who kind of takes things that are best in class, like, let's say bundlers like Webpack that are kind of were considered like maybe best in class and perhaps still are, and depending on your use case. But taking tools like that and then just creating something that is just seems to really, I think, serve a different set of constraints very well. Specifically, I think constraints that are good for the open web, right? So how do we use standards, open standards better? How do we ship less JavaScript? How do we create more performant web experiences? And Svelte is kind of, I feel like, in that same vein. I think like it's good for the open web. So can you maybe talk to us a little bit about some of the kind of inspirations and like origin story behind Svelte? I know you came on the show before. You've been on you were on Changelog like 3 years ago, I think, January 30th. We'll link to the episode. It's a great episode. But I'm just curious if you could summarize the origin story for us.
I can certainly try. Svelte is sort of the culmination of stuff that I've been thinking about since, 10 years ago, roughly when I first started writing JavaScript, and I was trying to do, interactive articles of the kinds that you would see on places like the New York Times. And I was like a very newbie programmer, and what I found was that it's hard. Like there weren't very good tools for doing what we now think of as state-driven, component-driven user interfaces. And so I started kind of daydreaming about what tools would make my life easier, and then I stopped daydreaming and I started building them. And so for several years, I maintained a project called Reactive, which was me just sort of trying to scratch my own itch. And then after I gained a bit more experience as a programmer, and I started to become aware of different ways of solving some of these problems, the idea that turned into Svelte took root in 2016. And so Svelte is it's a continuation of that idea. Is like, how do we make creating interactive content on the web as easy as possible, but combined with some slightly more sophisticated thinking than its predecessor project had around how you do that in a way that is going to deliver like a very small JavaScript bundle with a very performant user experience. And that's how it started. I mean, it's since evolved into a much more sort of comprehensive set of ideas about web development. We kind of had a realization a couple of years ago that we weren't really designing a framework, we're actually designing a language. It's a language for expressing user interfaces. But all of the ancillary stuff that goes around that is, SvelteKit is this meta framework that is our take on how you should build web apps, like from soup to nuts, as opposed to just the component framework part. And all of the libraries that go around it is like, this is how we think about the problem of web development, like writ large.
I feel like there's so many good tools that come out of newsrooms, especially ones that do like really fancy graphics like the New York Times. Is there some secret sauce, or like what are the conditions that lead to all of these awesome tools?
I think the conditions are very important. So for to give some examples of the sort of thing that you're talking about, the New York Times graphics department, I was a member of it for a while. Before that, Jeremy Ashkenas was in the graphics department and had other jobs at the Times. And he created Backbone, he created Underscore, he created CoffeeScript, like things that have had seismic impacts on the JavaScript ecosystem. And specifically within DataViz, Mike Bostock created D3 very largely while he was working at the New York Times graphics department. And there have been other examples as well. Gregor Reich has done a lot of really cool open source, and he was a member of the department. And my thesis is that the reason that happens is because when you're building stuff in a newsroom, the constraints are just a little bit tighter than in more mainstream engineering for a variety of reasons. Number one, the obvious one is like you're working on the news, operating at the speed of news, and like you do not have time to futz around with, you know, a Babel config or something like that, right? You just got to ship. And because of that, there is this very strong bias towards tools that are like as self-explanatory as possible and are like well documented with good examples. Sorry?
Like low barrier, for example, like, you know.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
And that's the other side of it, because like a lot of the people who are using these tools in a newsroom, they're not like, you know, JavaScript rockstar ninjas. They're like people who learn JavaScript in order to do their jobs better. And so the consequence of that is that tools that have an unnecessarily steep learning curve or a lot of incidental complexity, they don't tend to succeed. And so there's a lot of homegrown stuff that gets its test in that fairly high pressure environment. And it turns out that if you can solve the problems of developing, you know, small but fast and rich applications in a short space of time, then you've kind of solved a lot of the problems that web developers face more broadly. And so because of that, you know, D3 has certainly succeeded outside the newsroom. Underscore and Backbone took over, like it seems strange to say this now, but like back in the day, Underscore and Backbone just completely changed the face of web development, and as did CoffeeScript, it gave way to ES6. And you know, Svelte has seen a lot of pickup outside newsrooms. It's being used in all sorts of different contexts, far from what it was originally built for. And I think that's because, you know, as I say, you solve the newsroom case and you've basically solved like web development more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the news is like, it's open web first, right? I think that's what, yeah, I think drives a lot of just, you know, healthy innovation, but also I feel like both e-commerce and news sites seem to really exercise like many APIs and like I think a lot of richness of the web, right? So folks are thinking about SEO, they're thinking about images, they're thinking about content management, they're thinking about styling, they're thinking about performance, they're thinking about, you're right, embedded third-party content, you know, like there's so much there, and all of that like being delivered to you kind of like hot off the presses, right? So it really is like fascinating to hear like how much creativity has kind of birthed out of that space. And to kind of maybe shift that a little bit, like, so you're now kind of, I guess you've moved on from the New York Times, and you're working kind of full time, and you've got I would say more of a pure focus on your open source projects, which is like really exciting. And for me, like Vercel is like definitely like, you know, like when like a really attractive person walks into a room, right? And I feel like Svelte is like another really attractive person walking into the same room, and like those two attractive people like found each other. Like that's I feel like they're asking each other out. Like that's how I feel. Like I feel like Vercel and Svelte, like it's a marriage that like makes sense, because I think at the core, like Vercel is really pushing performant web experiences, more turnkey developer experiences, you know, and I feel like Svelte is kind of tackling those same things just from a different angle. And so can you tell us a little bit about like, give us the Vercel story, and like, you know, what's like, what can we expect with, you know, with their support towards your projects?
Well, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there, talking about like Vercel being a place that is trying to make the web more performant and also more turnkey. And I think the reason that it makes sense for me to have a home at Vercel, is because
Or
Svelte and
like,
Vercel
don't you mean like for you to have like Vercel's number, like because you know you're like a, you know, an attractive person that's like maybe trying to get to know this other. Just kidding.
I mean, if you want to talk about attractive people, like this all happened a couple of months after Guillermo slid into my DMs. So
Well.
yeah,
The plot thickens, you know.
right. You know, Vercel and Svelte are both very concerned with how you sort of democratize web development, but in a way that doesn't compromise user experience. Obviously, Vercel is attacking that problem in a far more like expansive sense. You know, Svelte is purely focused on authoring front ends, but there's this kind of philosophical alignment. So it just makes sense that that like Vercel would want to invest in a framework like Svelte. You know, they have customers who are using Svelte, and there's always been like interplay between Svelte Kit and Next, for example. So like the hope from the Vercel side, as I understand it at least, is that by investing in Svelte becoming a better framework, it's better for, you know, Vercel's customers, it's better for the web like at large, because it means that like one of the like I guess we can call Svelte one of the major frameworks at this point has like proper backing. And from my side, it makes total sense because, you know, the biggest blocker to Svelte's development for me over the last couple of years has been my lack of ability to devote time to it, and that's now solved. And so I'm feeling really optimistic about what we're going to be able to get done over the next year. And I think it's already starting to pay dividends. Like we're actually making some solid progress on SvelteKit towards 1.0, which, you know, we had been making progress, but it's just really hard when you don't have someone working on this stuff full time.
What on the roadmap are you most excited about other than SvelteKit 1.0?
There's a long list of things. I hesitate to use the word roadmap because that implies that we've actually figured out what the priorities are and decided to devote resource to them. At the moment, it's really more of a wish list. And some of the things that we talk about are generating, so that for context, one part of Svelte, the main part of Svelte, I guess, is the compiler, right, which turns your declarative component code into the equivalent imperative JavaScript, essentially. And it works really well. Like you get these tiny bundles in most cases. But if you have a huge number of components and you're not using code splitting for whatever reason, then like the generated JavaScript will grow faster than like your component source code size. And in some cases, you can hit the inflection point where your Svelte bundle is larger than your React bundle would have been, for example. Doesn't happen often, but it can. We think we have a solution to that, which incidentally might also give us the ability to implement things like error boundaries and stuff like that. So
Like,
stuff like that.
At build time, like error boundaries at runtime.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
So like that's an idea that's percolating at the moment. Also, Vercel is super keen on Rust right now, and so I've started thinking, should I learn Rust? Should we rewrite the Svelte compiler in Rust? Maybe it's a terrible idea. I don't know, but I think it's at the very least worth investigating. What else? Got lots of big ideas around what motion and transitions could look like in a framework if they were a little bit more unified. This is something that Svelte's always been pretty good at. Like we have declarative transitions for when elements enter the stage and leave the stage, but I think we can probably push that further and like do some really funky stuff with interpolating between different page layouts and stuff like that.
I have to say, the transitions are just like my favorite part about Svelte. Like I'll go back and forth between React and Svelte projects, and like being able to just say, you know, like animate in, and then it does, and not have to, you know, pull in a library or write more code.
Yeah, so and like the React team have occasionally talked about making that stuff easier in React. Like adding APIs that will allow you to defer the unmounting of elements, for example. But it's super hard, and it's something that you've got to actively prioritize, because if there's one thing that we've learned from the process of building those transitions, is that like it's got to be like a first class consideration as you're building the framework is kind of deeply tied in there. And so I don't know, we'll see. But as I say, I think we can take that idea and supercharge it. So yeah, there's a whole list of things, none of which I'm ready to commit to, but all of which we're going to be looking at in 2022.
Yeah, no, that's really exciting. I mean, it's just, it seems like basically folks at Vercel have kind of, it's like they're giving you an official like sponsorship, in the sense that like, hey, we see the value of this, we care about performance, and I feel like they're kind of really putting their money where their mouth is in many ways, and it's really nice. It's a great thing to see. So again, congratulations on that opportunity, and we're all hopefully going to benefit from their sponsorship, and that's like the beauty of open source, is the stadium the stadium effect of our code. So I'm just curious, like we talked about like SvelteKit a little bit. I feel like there's maybe just something that we're skirting around a little, which is this very intentional decision to be more full featured, right? So if you look at libraries like React, like they're very clear about like, this is a UI library, we don't even consider ourselves a framework, right? And then like you have tools like Angular and Ember that are much more opinionated about like how you should be using them, and they come with all the bells and whistles, right? Angular, I think personally, great for enterprise teams in many ways. Like it's easier to control large groups of people, like when there's those types of conventions built in. And I feel like Svelte is somewhere in between. It's not as like rigid as Angular, but it's definitely there's less potential pitfalls than maybe using a tool like React that like lets you bend all the ways if you really want to. And so can you maybe just talk a little bit about that decision? Like what were some of those constraints around, like how'd you find that happy balance, right? Where you want to let people, like you want to kind of, I love the Scratch team at MIT. They have this wonderful analogy the analogy is high walls, high ceilings, wide walls, low floors, right? So low floors meaning like it's easy for new people to come in and use it. Wide walls as in like you can do lots of different things with it. And high ceilings as in like it doesn't stop expert users, like people who want to like go crazy and go ham and like make the complicated thing. They can do it, right? So it's very difficult to design an interface and design an API that like meets all of those criteria. It's like good for newbies, good guardrails, and lets experts run. Like, so could you talk about some of those constraints and decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the guiding light for us is this something that enough people are going to need that it makes sense to have it in the framework? And for example, every app that has ever been built on the web, with a very few contrived exceptions, needs CSS. So if your framework doesn't include like a blessed way to include styles in your project, then it is leaving a huge chunk of work to the user of that tool. And this is something that I'm a little surprised that more frameworks haven't kind of adopted. Vue is a framework, obviously, that has opinions about how to get your CSS into an app, but React and all of the React-alike frameworks out there just kind of leave it to developers, which, like, to me, that just feels like an abdication of responsibility. And there is a good argument why you would do that, and the argument I think that that React would make is that by being deliberately bare-boned about this stuff and letting the community come up with its own conventions, you get more people working on the problem, and the best ideas will float to the surface, and like you can sort of gradually adopt them. But in the meantime, like you're causing a lot of confusion and a lot of work for your users, and particularly in the environment in which Svelte was created, where we don't have time to mess around with stuff like that. Like, it makes total sense that styling would be a first-class concern of the framework. And the same goes for things like, the transitions that we talked about. Any kind of motion, like if you want to get spring physics in your user interface, then you can do that in Svelte with an import that comes from inside the Svelte package. And that's there because we want to encourage people to think of that as part of what you get when you use a framework, as opposed to a problem that we're giving you to solve. But where historically we drew the line was Svelte was very much a component framework in the manner of React or Vue. Angular and Ember were these sort of app frameworks. And because of the very different ways that you can use a component framework, and in particular at the New York Times, we had these very esoteric requirements that Svelte needs to integrate with our workflow, which is primarily driven by Google Docs. And so you just couldn't have this opinionated application framework that is going to be able to serve all of these very different use cases. And so it's always been very important that Svelte is this compiler that you can use however you like. You can build your own server-side rendering solution. You can build your own build tool plugins, all of that stuff. It's completely freeform. But that obviously leaves a gap, which is someone coming to Svelte for the first time is well, how the hell do I build an app with this? And our answer for that historically has been a little bit lackluster. Whereas if you go to Angular or you go to Ember, then it just tells you from the beginning, this is how you build an app. The problem, of course, is that you can't use Angular components inside a non-Angular app, and you can't use Ember components inside a non-Ember app. I mean, maybe you can. Maybe there's somewhere in the bowels of the documentation where you can figure out how to do that, but you are very much discouraged from doing so. And I think that has real downsides. And so SvelteKit is supposed to be the thing that serves that, it solves that problem of okay, so now what? How the hell do I begin writing an app without getting rid of any of the flexibility that those expert users need? So SvelteKit is the low floor. Svelte is, I guess, the high ceiling. I can't remember which was the high ceiling and which were the wide walls.
Wide walls is do lots of things with it, and high ceiling is unlimited complexity, go crazy, go build, you can go vertically complex, right? And so, does that make sense?
It does,
and this attribution is to the MIT Scratch team. We'll put a link in the show notes to an article where they talked about that. But Scratch is a programming language for kids, ironically written in JavaScript now. And I worked at a little company that you might know called Boku. We helped actually the MIT Scratch team do a full rewrite from Flash. This is a Flash-based application, and we converted it into JavaScript and help them convert it into JavaScript, and it's actually using React. It's one of the most complicated React applications, I think, on the open web, and it's beautiful and performant, and thanks to the lovely engineers at Boku who put a lot of thought into, I think, how to make it fast, but definitely worth checking out. So Rich, we're going to take a break because there's so much good stuff to get into. I want to talk about comparisons, there's community, there's so much. So we'll be right back after these short messages, kids. All right, break, we're done. Okay, so we're still live on YouTube, so don't say anything you don't want on the internet. But we're not, this is not going to be on the actual show. So do you need a water break, bathroom break, stretch break?
I am.
I
came prepared.
Perfect, you came prepared, love it. Awesome, you're doing great. I'm so sorry for the confusion earlier. So I hit the recording button, which is what took us live right away. I was clearly very confused. I forgot to hit the live button, which is why you didn't hear the music. I was dancing to music and you two couldn't hear it. And Jared told me, and I'm like, oh my God. So there was intro music that I was playing in the beginning. So yeah, sorry for the awkwardness, Rich. So I think, so what I want to get into next is, I kind of want to kick off with, I want to get into the React comparisons and the why Svelte stuff and kind of suss that out a little bit. But before that, I was thinking about maybe talking about adoption of Svelte, right? Because you said something earlier around Svelte is now maybe considered one of the major frameworks, and I want to kind of push you and say, really, is it? Prove it. I kind of want to know, because I think most people think of it as this niche library, and it's actually much more widely used than people think. So So I just want to get into that. And then from there, I want to get into like some of the specifics around like the comparisons, right? So, and we can just maybe use React as like, just to kind of use one library as an example, like we can cross compare, like what's the difference between Svelte and React, and take it from there. Amelia, does that sound good to you as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yep.
All right. So everyone ready? We'll get back in. All right. So Rich, thank you for that wonderful background and context around Svelte and SvelteKit. It was really great to, I think, learn about some of the decisions behind your, like, what came to be this interface and, these constraints. It's great. So you said something earlier around, Svelte is maybe considered one of the major frameworks, and I kind of want to challenge you on that a little bit. So I want to say, really, Svelte? No, not really Svelte. Really, Rich? You're just going to call you Svelte from now on. So really, Rich, like, is Svelte really considered a major framework? Because it takes it doesn't always take a while, but it does take a while for JavaScript UI frameworks to kind of hit a tipping point where they're considered like production ready, stable, well supported, etc. And so great, this project is now funded by Vercel. That's awesome. But like, who else is using it? And it's been around for 5 years, but it seems like it's taken 5 years to maybe hit the quote unquote mainstream. So I'm just curious if you could maybe share some of the adoption metrics with us.
Yeah, I don't know if I would even now call it mainstream per se, but I think we have like a pretty sizable mind share at this point, even though it's not being used nearly as widely as React and Vue. It's something that a lot of developers have heard of. A lot of developers are excited to try it. And I think what is probably keeping the NPM download numbers from being higher than they are is that for a long time, companies were very reluctant to try and use something that wasn't supported by a full-time maintainer. Mm-hmm. That's feedback that I've heard a lot. Like, people will tell me that me and my co-workers, we want to use Svelte to build this project, but our project manager or our CTO says, no, you can't do that because it's someone's like project. And that hasn't really been true for a long time. Like, we have a pretty active core team. And we're discussing
they all
the framework
work nights
every
and
single
weekends?
day.
Okay, no. They're not just.
I'm the only,
it's not
I'm the
like
only
a
full-time
nights and
maintainer
weekends.
still.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm the only full-time maintainer still, but there's like a lot of people who work on the project on like a fairly regular basis.
That's awesome.
But now that it's got the backing of Vercel, I'm starting to hear people turn around and say, well, actually, we can reconsider that decision. So the NPM numbers, to be specific, we get 200,000 downloads a week, which is not a huge number, but it's doubled since the beginning of this year. Mm-hmm. And I calculated the other day that if it continues doubling every year, then by 2037, everyone on the planet will be downloading Svelte once a week. So we're not that far from global domination. When I say that we're one of the major frameworks, what I really mean is that other frameworks have, like in a few cases, been influenced by Svelte's design decisions. When people announce new things, like new cloud things, they will very often say, okay, here is how you build a Svelte app on it. But it's like one of the first things that they have in their introductory documentation. Like Cloudflare Pages just came out and they used SvelteKit as their example of how to build a Cloudflare Pages site. And I think once you sort of breach that level of awareness, I think it's probably fair to count yourself as one of the major frameworks, even if you are by far the smallest. And I'm pretty confident that we're going to keep growing. Like, we have pretty high satisfaction numbers. We got the most satisfied result in the most recent State of JavaScript survey, and we were the most loved framework in the Stack Overflow developer survey this year. So it stands to reason that we're going to keep gaining adoption. But at the same time, adoption is not why we do this. Adoption is not the metric to try and optimize. It's just something that tells you whether or not you are in fact optimizing the right things.
If you look at JavaScript frameworks, there's like a hype cycle. If you chart like how much people like it and how much people use it, okay, how much you like it is on the x-axis and how much you use it is on the y-axis. Usually they'll go like to the right and then up. So like when people really like it, there's definitely an increase in usage coming, and then like you'll see the opposite on the way down. Like eventually too many developers will have to use it for work, and then they'll hate it, and then they'll stop using it.
Yeah, that is 100% going to happen. I mean, I think it's probably already starting to happen with Svelte. Like when we got those most satisfied and most loved recognitions, that was driven by the fact that the people who are currently using Svelte are people who've chosen to use Svelte, and so they're already sort of sold on the idea of a template driven framework and all of the other decisions that Svelte makes, which are different to other frameworks. And there's definitely going to be a point at which that's no longer the case. So I'm not expecting that we're going to like necessarily win the same recognition next year, but as long as the people who want to use Svelte continue wanting to use Svelte, and as long as the people who are forced to use Svelte can tolerate using Svelte, then I think we're doing okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so for me, like, this just brings back, like, one of the reasons why I was excited about Svelte, like, I'm reminded now, it's because, like, I was like, wow, this is a project that's not sponsored by Facebook, Microsoft, Google, whatever, like, billion-dollar, gajillion-dollar company. Like, I feel like if you look at the landscape of the JavaScript open source, like, community right now, and you look at like what are the projects to get the most quick adoption, wide adoption, whatever, companies are using metrics like, hey, are there people who are paid to work on this? They're using things like that. Like you look at projects like Rush, and you look at projects like Lerna, and you look at like how quickly it was, like, how hard Lerna worked to get to their numbers, and then Lerna is like monorepo management like tool, and so same for Rush, but Rush came out of Microsoft. We'll put a link in our show notes. But like I feel like Rush came out and people were like, oh great, like a company backed like Lerna alternative, and totally fine, nothing wrong with company backed software, all good, right? Vercel is doing the same thing in many ways. But the idea is, I feel like the spirit of open source and community and open governance is also kind of lost in projects like that, And I feel like it's with Vercel, like your relationship is a little different. Like it's still your project. They're sponsoring you to work on it, but like I still feel like the governance and all of those things are still very grassroots, and open to influence by people who use the library, and that's very different than React. And we had a wonderful conversation with Sophie a couple weeks ago, who was a lead on the React team, Sophie Alpert with a P, and she was like talking about the challenges around open governance in React, and yeah, it is absolutely the core team show. It's like there's and that's it can cause friction in the community sometimes, especially when you have a lot of smart people with opinions that are quite often like not all bad. You know what I mean? So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. A project like React is used for such a wide variety of projects, and I mean, I guess it's true of all front-end frameworks that you are going to get a lot of different decisions. And we've always prided ourselves on being, to the extent possible, without things devolving into absolute chaos, this consensus and community-driven project. And the core team is very diverse. We have people from all sorts of different backgrounds working on it.
Probably all over the world, right? It's probably folks that aren't geographically co-located either, which is wonderful
for the web. Project.
Yeah, wonderful for the web. I mean, for me, like, my life mission is to like increase the number of people, like change the percentage of folks who are writing for the web so that they are more reflective of the people using the web. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Let's have those demographics mirror each other so that like we create inclusive and delightful tools and applications. So
yeah, really and it manifests itself in real ways. Like when we're discussing, features inside Svelte or SvelteKit, we'll often have like a lot of back and forth between people who just had these very different experiences and can speak to some of those decisions in different ways. And that makes the project much stronger than if the team was a lot more homogenous and people had had the same kinds of experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean that's like a hot topic in itself, but we'll have to save that for another show. But thank you for that. I'm really, yeah, it really makes me happy to hear that. And just congrats to you and the team. I hope you're able to continue fostering that level of contribution that's varied and diverse. It's important for the web. And so I'm curious, like, to kind of segue a little bit into kind of maybe some of the specifics around like why Svelte. I'd like to kind of maybe prefix this conversation with like, hey, like everybody who's listening to this, like APIs get deprecated, people don't, right? And so when we're talking about like this tool versus that tool, like we're talking about it from an objective perspective, and it's not personal. This is not like about beef or flame wars or anything. Like we're just engineers having an objective conversation, and so I just want to prefix the rest of this segment with that kind of warning or context. So with that said, Rich, can you tell us, like, if we're just going to pick React, let's just pick on React because it's like it's the big, it's the one to beat, right? So if we're kind of doing apples to apples, like, why Svelte over React? Like, can you maybe give me some of the specifics around, like, if I were to like if I'm like starting a new project, like, why should I start it with Svelte versus React, like, today?
And the short answer is you'll ship faster. And
I thought you said the word "you'll shit faster," and I was like, "Wait, no, that's weird."
I mean that may also happen, but it's
like,
we're not going to include that in our marketing.
We'll edit this out. Anyway, so you want to start over? We'll ship faster.
Okay, so the short answer is you'll ship faster. At least that's what we believe. And there's caveats to that, obviously. If you're someone who is already experienced with React, then it's going to take you a beat to learn how to use Svelte. But overall, the argument for Svelte is that because of the design decisions that we've taken, like the foundational design decisions, that we have this compiler-centric mentality where we're essentially designing a component language as opposed to trying to express user interface semantics in a language which is fundamentally ill-suited to them, namely JavaScript. Because of that, you can express concepts much more concisely and idiomatically in a Svelte component than you can using React. And a lot of people will just disagree with me vehemently on that, but my observation has been that, for example, if you convert a React component to a Svelte component, it will be about 40% smaller in terms of the bytes of code that you have to write. And that has real consequences on how, like, obviously how fast you can write the component because you're physically writing less stuff, but it's also more readable. Less code is more readable than more code. And
also
when you have less code, it is more maintainable.
Easier to change too, right?
Easier to change.
I've heard you often say something that I personally take with me as like my new mantra, which is like optimize for change, and I think, less code is easier to change, like hands down.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been some research, not a huge amount, but there's been some research into how many bugs you will write for a given amount of code. And it turns out that the relationship between the amount of code that you write and the number of bugs in your app is basically the same across all different languages, but the relationship is super linear with the amount of code that you have. So if you have a 10,000 line app, then you will have more than 10 times the number of bugs you will have in a 1,000 line app. So if you can write code as concisely as possible without it becoming like this Perl-like, gibberish, then generally you will find that your application is going to be more robust. So that is like the big argument, and that's changed a little bit because we used to think about Svelte in very different terms. When it first came out, the big selling point was you can make tiny JavaScript bundles, because at the time, we were coming out of this era when desktop frameworks had predominated, but mobile was becoming the more important place to write stuff on the web. And we were shipping too much JavaScript to our users. We're still shipping too much JavaScript to our users, but that was like the most urgent problem. And so that's what Svelte initially was aimed at solving, was just making bundles smaller. And because it's compiling to this sort of vanilla JavaScript without this the heavy virtual DOM machinery. It also means that your updates are faster. So that's what people first associated with Svelte, is the small and fast, and that is why it's called Svelte. But nowadays we think about it more in terms of how it affects how you think about the code that you're writing.
So, okay, let's see if you can solve this for me. So all my coworkers know that I would start new projects with Svelte if I could. And we're really focused on prototyping really quickly. It'd be awesome. But the issue is, if we use React, there's like 1 million libraries that we can use for, accessible components that are really easy to throw in. Which, Svelte can't do anything about, right? Because it takes a long time and a large community to build up that wealth of components. But that's like my biggest hang up with, we do need to go fast, and sometimes pulling in like other modules is super helpful.
Yeah, component libraries, there's a lot of Svelte component libraries. I don't personally tend to use them because I don't typically need to, because of the sorts of apps that I'm building. But there are component libraries out there. I can't vouch for any one in particular, but they do exist. What I'm hoping is that the release of SvelteKit is going to make it much easier for people to build really high quality component libraries. And that's because SvelteKit, in addition to being a framework for building applications, it's a framework for building component libraries. And I've used it for a couple of libraries so far, and it's just a much nicer workflow for building libraries than anything I've used in the past. And so, hopefully, touch wood, the release of SvelteKit is going to mean that there's a bit of an explosion of component libraries, and we'll check back in a few months to see if that's happened. But I think that is the kind of problem that solves itself over time. And so if you're looking to build something immediately and you want to have a ready-made set of component libraries, then React is probably the way to go. But that's not like a foundational technology choice. That is something that happens to be the case right now and will probably stop being the case at some point in the future. So, it depends on your time scale, it depends on your appetite for building some of the stuff yourself, and it depends on how you're evaluating technologies.
So Reg, I'm curious, so this problem of ecosystem that Amelia brings up is very real, right? It's absolutely a reason why people hold off on adoption. They need that table library, they need that, material UI library, they need whatever, they need all those bells and whistles in order to kind of continue at least working at the same pace that they would with another ecosystem, right? So you don't want to compromise on that, but I'm just curious, as a community, at what point are we going to start really leveraging a web primitive, CSS, and JavaScript to create this accordion widget one time for all the libraries to use, right? Because at the end of the day, React, Angular, Ember, Backbone, all of these libraries are still just outputting to web primitives, right? And so isn't there a way for us to just kind of write this once and let people import it into the languages and framework, or the frameworks of their choice, right? So if you want to interact with this thing in this way, great. But ultimately, I kind of think it's ridiculous for us to start over and create a whole new ecosystem and solve problems yet again, just using a different interface. Isn't that kind of bizarre to you that we're going to start this over?
It's almost like you're trying to goad me into sharing spicy.
Actually, so I wanted to talk about web components, but then I was like, let me not get eye rolls, because people are just gonna eye roll. But I'm like, shouldn't this just be a custom element? Shouldn't this just be I'm just kind of really, I'm curious, because it is a web primitive, or it is a web API, right? Mm-hmm. These are web APIs supported natively on the platform by majority of browsers, fairly well-ish. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think people tend to overstate that problem. The problem of having to rewrite things for different frameworks, because there aren't that many frameworks. And having to rewrite something in in 3 frameworks is a tractable problem. Having to rewrite it in 1,000 frameworks would not be. But that's not the situation that we find ourselves in. So like I would firstly just push back on the notion that we've got to rewrite this for every single framework is like a fundamental problem. It is a nuisance. It would be better if we didn't have to do that. But the web has these very unique constraints, and unfortunately, my opinion, having dabbled in this space for long enough, is that web components do not solve it. For
Well,
a variety of
API,
reasons.
certainly the API failed to meet, I think, DX and like, right, there's certain usability aspects to web components that just don't jive with developers, right? There's certainly like a disconnect with like where developers are and how people write modern web apps and what you need to do to get web components to like work at mass and scale, right? Like it's not
Yeah.
there's a disconnect, there's definitely a chasm. But I just feel like, I don't know, maybe you're right, like maybe it is not that big of a problem. I just feel like we need to like have a hackathon where like every 1 week is like Svelte ecosystem week, and everyone just like picks the component that they need to rewrite from this thing to that thing, and then boom, here it is in Svelte. Because I don't know, I find it a little ridiculous that we're just wasting any amount of brain power on solved problems, right? Like solve problems in a different color, like it's like just I feel like web developers are the smartest people on earth, and I just feel like that's not a good use of brain time. Like making a new button type is like not a good use of brain time for me anyway, and that's like my salty opinion,
I mean, you're not wrong, but ultimately, if these things are important enough that we're rewriting them in multiple frameworks, then they're probably things that belong in the platform in the first place.
Correct.
And
Agreed.
my hope with web components back in the day was that that they were going to allow us to create the cow paths that would later get paved, and we haven't been paving those cow paths for a variety of reasons, and so like we're kind of left with this way of describing components that doesn't even work without JavaScript, which is like just fatal for progressive enhancement and all of these other things. And so I don't know. I've just got so tired of thinking about web components and like how hard they make it for me to build the apps that I want to make, that I've just stopped thinking about it. I'm just going to use Svelte, and I'm going to target non-custom elements, and I'm going to have a great time doing it. If other people want to try and solve the many problems with web components, then that's great.
Different bag of problems, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
A different bag of problems that an increasingly like shrinking group of developers seem to be caring about as well. So, it's so I thank you so much for that, like for weighing in on that and humoring me, and you did a really good job of like avoiding that pitfall. So good job. Points for you, Rich. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back. There's lots of hot topics to continue discussing with Rich. Talk to you in a few minutes, everyone. Bye. All right. So break. All right. Thank you, Rich. Awesome job, Amelia and Rich. I think we've like covered a lot of ground, which is great. Does anyone need like a water break, bathroom break, stretch break?
All good.
All good. Okay. So just something I wanted to make sure we had time to touch on is kind of maybe not a controversial, but like React kind of being a platform that supports being a library that supports multiple platforms like iOS and Android. I feel like I'd love to talk about that and Svelte, because I'm just kind of want to suss out this conversation that I had with someone around like, hey, is React actually the best choice if you're developing for just the web? Like, and my answer is no. Like, and I'm like, well, okay, in what world is React actually justifiable in 2021 or 2022? And for me, that world is like, if you're developing for multiple platforms, maybe then it's the best choice for you. But so I'm just curious if you like would want to get into that. You're nodding. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, are there plans for like a mobile native like experience for Svelte even? I'm just
I mean,
curious.
it exists. It's not like an official part of the project, but there's a thing called Svelte Native, which uses native script. And there's various other things out there. Like there's a thing that wraps Node GUI with Svelte components. So like people are trying to solve this problem, and it's certainly possible that they would get upgraded to official status at some point. There's also things that like aren't Svelte specific, but things that will take your PWA and turn it into a native app and give you access to native device APIs. So I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think it'd be good to touch upon that just because I think that is a barrier for some folks, you know, in terms of selling it to your manager, you know. And so I'd love to touch that. Amelia, do you want to take out, or do you want, I don't know.
I want to know if, Rich, I feel like you've been doing a lot of podcasts recently. Is there anything that you haven't gotten to talk about yet? Yeah. Maybe at like Vercel or...
Nothing springs to mind.
Cool.
Wait, have you talked about like your hair routine? Like, you have great hair, so
you're very kind.
Conditioning after.
I do not have a routine. This
is
how I wake up. This is how it looks.
You're like Beyonce. Hashtag I woke up like this. You know. Okay. All right. So, Amelia, I don't know. Do you want to kick us off? Or the next? I feel like I've been talking a lot. So, do you want to kick us off, or I don't know? You don't have to.
I'm enjoying listening. I was also going to say like community. Like, I'd love to hear more about like community efforts for Svelte, but I don't know if that's okay. Cool.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about that.
So I think for me, what I had for the third segment was ecosystem, community, and what's next. We've already talked about ecosystem, so we're good. So I think if maybe we cover the native mobile thing, then we can talk about community and maybe what, like broadly, what's next. I mean, I feel like you kind of talked about that initially, Rich, like what's next? Is there anything that you think you didn't talk about in this podcast?
I could talk a little bit about like Svelte Cubed is our WebGL
Oh my goodness.
Stuff like that.
All right. Okay. All right. So it's like Svelte X or Svelte Next, you know, like since that's like the term that, or Svelte next gen, that's like the word that all the, you know, anyways, I've worked on a lot of next gen projects. Let's just put it that way. Okay. We'll get started. Amelia, you need a break or anything? You're good?
I'm good. I'm happy for you to kick this off since it's your question. I feel like you phrased it really well.
I don't know about that. I don't know. I saw some faces from Rich. He's like, I don't want to talk about mobile, but you know, if you're gonna make me do it, then fine. Like,
I'm happy to talk about it. It's
trust
just
me,
I'm not a mobile developer.
I am
so
a DGAF when it comes to mobile.
Then.
Yeah, I'm married to a mobile engineer, and we have fights all the time about this. Okay, so I'll get us started. 1, 2, 3. Calm down, Amel. Take a breath. All right, so Rich, thank you for walking us through part 1 of Hot Topics. Part 1 of Hot Topics in the open source community. It's like a never-ending story. Actually, Amelia, remember we were like kind of preparing for this show earlier today. I think you said something really funny. Do you want to share it? Like he's like the king of hot takes.
Oh, there's actually they're filming a Svelte documentary, which I think we can talk about.
Yeah, we can.
They came to my house with all their film gear, which is very intimidating, and they like got all situated, and they're like, "Can you describe Rich Harris?" And I was like, "Oh man, I don't know." And the first thing that came out was like, "He's the king of hot takes, but they're also not hot takes because they're all very reasonable." And they were like, "Let's do that again." But those are my true feelings.
I can definitely relate to the like what it's like to have a camera shoved in your face and being asked questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say you're definitely really good at hot takes. Like you're also really great at like I feel like when there's like gasoline all over the floor, you're really great at like showing up with a match on Twitter and then dropping the match, you know? And it's like boom, you know? There goes Twitter for today, you know? Like literally like 3 weeks later, I'm still getting like likes and like mentions on like threads that like, you know, where, you know, Rich inserts himself into like sharing a very reasonable opinion about JavaScript. For what it's worth, I agree with you like 99, actually 100% of the time, if I'm honest.
Thank you.
But yeah, no, seriously, you're awesome. So kind of just to kind of continue our hot topics. So React, like been using the library forever. Really, it helped me, I think, even be better at JavaScript. It helped kind of really democratize the component model that we were kind of skirting around for a very long time as a community, right? So I really, I'm very thankful for, I think, the way it's helped push certain things forward, right? However, I think there's certain things around performance and other things where I feel like maybe React has kind of stagnated, right? And for me, it's, I think, a product of its success in many ways. React is a project that really supports a wide variety of applications and platforms. It's support and this reconciliation algorithm and this virtual DOM and this synthetic events and all of these things that are kind of like extraneous and not necessarily found in other projects, in the web. Like if you can look at Preact, Svelte, right? Like y'all don't need a virtual DOM, y'all don't need synthetic events, right? Extremely performant, much smaller bundler size. But the constraint that React has is like we output to many DOM trees, not DOM trees, but like platformy trees, right? So iOS and Android being the other two major platforms. And so it's got some bloat because of that. And so a kind of argument that I was having, a friendly argument that I was having with a friend of mine a few weeks ago was like, okay, is it safe to say at that point that maybe React is not the best choice if you're writing for just the web? And that was we agreed and he was like, yes, if you're just writing for the web, React is not the best choice. Because I was just trying to say, like, I don't think React is like, if I was starting a project in 2021 or 2022 now, almost for the web, I wouldn't pick React. I wouldn't, just because it's bulky. You know what I mean? I would try to pick something that's really going to force me to like use as little JavaScript as possible. And React is more than I need. It's more engine than I need if I'm just writing for the web. And so I'm just curious, like, do you feel like Svelte is like how is Svelte tackling this problem? Because I feel like for me, like Svelte feels very like web first, web only right now. Is there a mobile story? Have you tackled those constraints around multi-platform? Because, if I'm working at a company and I'm trying to get my manager to adopt Svelte, my manager's going to say, well, is there a native like library? Like, how does that work? I don't want to have to hire like folks to write Swift and Kotlin or whatever, so.
Yeah, I have many thoughts about all of this. I'm going to preface it all with saying that I am not a mobile developer. It's just
me neither.
Not a thing that I care about. I'm a web guy, and I would love it if native apps weren't a thing, and the web on mobile devices was capable enough that we could just get rid of all that. That said, it is true that React Native is probably the most tightly integrated way to build something on iOS and Android if you already have a React code base or you're familiar with web development. There are some things out there which will allow you to build native apps with Svelte. There is a project called Svelte Native, which is basically a wrapper around native script, which is sort of an interface that makes the mobile platform look like the DOM to whatever's using it. And there's a Vue version of this, and there's a Svelte version of this, and there's like a vanilla version of this. I haven't used it personally, but as far as I can tell, the results are pretty great. There's some other attempts in this space as well that are going on. There's one that I learned about recently that isn't yet public. That is, I think it's built on top of Node GUI or something like that. And there's a few of these things, so it is possible. There's also things out there that will allow you to use. You can give them your progressive web app, your PWA, and it will bundle that as a native app and give you access to device APIs. Again, haven't used them, can't vouch for them, but that, at least on the surface, would seem to solve the problem of deploying to mobile devices without having to hire Kotlin and Swift developers. And then finally, there's like the question of whether Svelte is going to be able to do this stuff natively at some point in the future. And there is there is a little bit of a misconception that Svelte is web only. Like obviously,
Interesting.
web is our priority. Like we are built on top of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. A Svelte component is a superset of HTML. But the compiler, when you're converting a component to JavaScript, it can go one of two ways. It can output code that targets the DOM, or it can output code that targets server-side rendering, which will take some data and just turn that into HTML. And those are very different. Like the compiler is doing a very different job in each of those cases. What we haven't done is make that process pluggable and expose it via an API. But we could. We could make it such that you could build your own outputter for the compiler. And it's something that we've talked about from time to time. It's never risen to the level of like a priority of something that we actively want to pursue. But we could, and then you would have an ability to build command line interfaces with Svelte and like other stuff like that, which you can do with React.
Yeah. It's like it opens up the mediums and the platform. It opens it up in ways that are like very interesting, when you have that level of pipeability between your outputs. But it's interesting.
So yeah, it's possible that Svelte will have more native support for native one day. For now, you can do it. There may be caveats. I'm not all that experienced, so I can't speak to them. But if like you want a battle tested solution for building native apps, then React Native is probably the best thing for right now.
That's interesting. And I'm glad to hear you say that. And I'm really curious to maybe see if in like a year you would like what your answer is, because I know like the exponential compound interest nature of JavaScript ecosystem, and like someone could have the solution like ready for this like tomorrow, so I'm curious to see how that pans out. But thank you for weighing in on that. So I know Amelia and I were really excited to like hear about Svelte's community. I mean, we can't kind of like end this show without talking about like community. It's like the currency of open source. It's the currency of everything that we do. I know there's an incredible kind of very active Svelte community, and like you said earlier, there are the people who have chosen to get into Svelte not because of work, but because they're hobbyists or people who really appreciate the API. So can you just maybe tell us a little about like the Svelte community and like where do y'all convene? You guys had your first conference recently, like.
Yeah, so it has a wonderful community. Our Discord has, I just opened the invite page to check these numbers. We have 35,000 people in our Discord, 4,000 of whom are online right now, which is like, nice. It's quite a lot of people. And that is where, so Discord is where people in the community gather to ask each other questions and share things that we're working on and like advertise jobs and so on. And svelte.dev/chat is how you find it. And yeah, there was a conference recently, so there's the Svelte, there's like the core team, the maintainers and people who work on that, and then there's also this kind of a sister organization called Svelte Society, and that is it's run by a few people, but the two people that I'm going to call out right now are Swix, who Sean Wang, everyone knows him as Swix. Was sort of the initial impetus behind this, because there was going to be a London meetup, and he was like, we can't, like New York cannot not have the first meetup when it's the city where Svelte was born, and so like he very quickly organized a meetup on the same day. So we had like the simultaneous London New York meetup. This was back in 2019, right before the pandemic.
That feels very classic Sean. Like he is like the most like driven and like hyper competitive in the best possible way, like person. I feel like he's just incredible. Very, very like
he's an absolute machine.
Hashtag goals, you know what I mean?
Yes, he's a remarkable guy. And so that was the birth of Svelte Society. There's also Svelte School, which is something set up by Kevin, who is also the host of the Svelte Radio podcast. And he made the first conferences happen. So back in, I think it was April 2020, we had the first virtual conference, and then we've had 2 more since then. And then last weekend, 2 weekends ago, we had the 4th virtual conference, but for the first time, we also had an in-person component to it here in Brooklyn. And that was wonderful. Like, we had a bunch of people come to an event space in Brooklyn, just down the road from where the old Brooklyn JS meetups used to happen before the pandemic shut the bar down.
Oh wait, was it in the exact same space as the Brooklyn JS?
No. So there's,
okay, because that was a pretty cool space.
Yeah, so 61 local is at 61 Bergen Street. Okay. We were in a place called the Invisible Dog at 51 Bergen Street. Oh. So just down the road.
Yeah, I mean, it's just down the road in like Hipsterville. I mean, it's like the coolest city in New York, really. I mean, coolest city in the country, I think. Brooklyn. Let's be honest. I mean, you can't get any cooler than that. So that's awesome.
I mean, the event was pretty cool, I thought.
I bet.
We had a wonderful turnout. People got together. There was a real feeling of sort of like, yes, we can actually start having tech meetups in person again.
Yeah.
And there was a really nice vibe. People were kind of milling about, playing board games and just chatting and catching up. And then we all went and played shuffleboard afterwards. It was good. And Guillermo and some of the Vercel crew flew in to join the meetup. He gave a little impromptu talk to the assembled people. It was also broadcast live on the internet. And it felt like a really nice moment because, as I say, it sort of coincides with Svelte's 5th birthday, and it was a really nice time to sort of take stock and think about like everything that the community has achieved and like where it's going in future.
Yeah, and then there's like that sounds amazing. And there's also like a newer community group called Svelte Sirens, I think, that's like geared towards
yes. I wanted to talk about Svelte Sirens.
Yeah, women and non-binary, I believe. So
yeah,
it was just great. You know, I'm so glad to see that there's spaces for folks that are underrepresented. You know, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's been like on the core team we've done a little bit of hand wringing about the fact that open source in general is a pretty homogenous scene, and particularly like early adopter open source tends to be even more homogenous. And like we've definitely felt that, but like the core team is also along certain dimensions pretty homogenous, and there's like limited things that we can do to fix that. So it really does need to kind of come organically from the community. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Svelte Sirens has arisen from the community, it's been spearheaded by Brittany Postma, who was at the summit 2 weeks ago.
She's incredible.
Wonderful person. Mm-hmm. Yeah, got to meet her for the first time. Absolutely brilliant person. Who's set this up with some other women and non-binary people from the community, and it makes my heart sing that that's happened.
Yeah. Just taking a moment. But yeah, no, that's great. So we've covered community, we've covered hot takes. I'm eager to hear like what's next, Rich. Like what's like cutting edge, next gen, next, mm-hmm. like for Svelte, like.
So next is SvelteKit 1.0. That's like everything is geared towards SvelteKit 1.0 right now. That's the big priority. And then I shared some of the wish list items for Svelte 4. In between that, there's a few little kind of side projects that I'm into. I released a library called Svelte Cubed recently, which is a Svelte wrapper around Three.js that allows you to build interactive 3D scenes with Three.js, but like as a declarative component scene.
Wow.
Which, yeah, it's. I mean,
wait,
it's not.
Are you making WebGL easy for? Are you making that easy for web developers? Because there's such a big barrier to entry with that stuff. Like it's like it sucks. Like it's painful.
That is the hope. I mean, so we're wrapping Three.js, right? And Three.js already does a lot of heavy lifting. Like if you've ever written raw WebGL code, it is unpleasant. It is really, really difficult to get your head around. I've spent a little bit of time in that world, not enough to develop any real expertise, but enough to get an appreciation for how much work libraries like Three.js are doing on your behalf. Mm-hmm. And so like 3 has done 95% of the work, and then Svelte Cubed aims to do like the last 5%, because working with 3 is kind of like working with the DOM. And like you can build applications just writing against the vanilla DOM APIs, but eventually you're going to run into some maintainability problems if you write code that way. In my experience, right, because of things like the fact that you're creating something that is essentially hierarchical, but you're not expressing it as a hierarchy. You're expressing it as like linear imperative code. At the same time, state management becomes very difficult when you're building things imperatively. If you have a component framework that lets you use the same idioms that you use elsewhere in your app to build WebGL stuff, then it does get a hell of a lot easier to manage. But you also get things like lifecycle management, which means that you get hot module reloading inside your 3JS classes, for example, which you will not get with 3 by itself. So it's not just making it slightly more idiomatic and slightly easier to use. It's actually improving the experience of building stuff in some fairly tangible but non-obvious ways as well. So I'm kind of excited about that. It's something that came out of a New York Times project over the summer, and now that it's open sourced, it's starting to get some contributions from people who actually know what they're doing. So I'm excited to see how that shapes out. And then, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna ask, as someone who's used React 3 Fiber, were there like implementation differences or API differences for using it, or is it pretty much similar?
So they're similar in the sense that they give you a declarative interface over 3JS, but in terms of implementation, they are wildly different. Because of, and here's where I've got to be careful, right? Because Paul, who wrote React 3 Fiber, will disagree with me on a lot of this, and I had to kind of channel his response as I'm saying this. But React 3 Fiber is not a component library; it is a renderer, and so it implements like basically, what React DOM gives you. It gives you that, but for 3JS essentially. And because of that, the implementation of React 3 Fiber is very complex. Like if you actually look at the code, it is doing an awful lot of very clever stuff to make that possible. And there are some like, what's the word I'm looking for? Some sort of theoretical advantages to thinking about implementing something as a renderer as opposed to a component library. Like you're sort of not how do I describe this? You're basically building your 3 graph directly, as opposed to creating components that create the graph for you. And in theory, that gives you some measure of defense against like breaking changes between 3JS versions and so on. But you have to weigh that against the implementation itself. From the user's perspective, I think the biggest difference is that you are typically just using 3JS classes inside your app. And you can do that in Svelte because you're not re-rendering your app every frame. In a React app, you can't re-render things frequently, and so because of that, you have this sort of intermediate layer which creates the classes and then updates them later. You can't do new 3.box geometry inside your component. I mean, you could, but it would be recreating that on every update, and that's going to be terrible for performance. In Svelte, you just don't have that problem. So for my money, the way that you use Svelte Cubed is a little bit more idiomatic than the way that you use React 3 Fiber. But someone who has used React 3 Fiber and is familiar with it, I would love to get your take on how it feels different and which things are nicer and which things are not as nice.
I'm so excited to dig in.
Yeah. I want Amelia's thoughts on all the things, especially when it comes to like anything visual. I feel like, yeah, you have like a really great instinct for like, I think API interfaces, like understanding how to represent information really well. Like, yeah, Rich and Amelia, if y'all haven't collaborated yet, like you should, for sure. But anyways, so just to kind of like wrap up this discussion, like I just kind of want to hear like maybe just really quickly, briefly, like your thoughts on HTML, because we haven't really touched on it in this show. But it does feel like we're making this full cycle on the web where we're back to kind of just rendering HTML, right? Astro kind of like boldly pushed the needle with like HTML only by default. JavaScript like makes it difficult for you to almost use JavaScript in a good way, right? Same thing for SvelteKit having that option, right? For like just outputting HTML. It's like, is the future HTML? Like, are we back to the web of the 90s? And and I kind of will say, like, we had a wonderful guest on our show last week, Selma Alumni Naylor. She's a wonderful developer advocate who actually just recently accepted a job at Netlify. So congratulations to her. But Selma had this like wonderful analogy of like we drank too much JavaScript and we have like a hangover, and now we've learned like we shouldn't be drinking so much JavaScript. Like we should take it easy, and like and so it feels like we're coming full circle. So I'm just curious, like if you have like thoughts on that, since you're clearly part of I think that movement in many ways.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. Yeah, and pendulum swing, right? And we're definitely swinging back towards the server, but we're in a different way. Actually, I don't really like the pendulum swinging metaphor because it kind of implies that overall there's this stasis and that you're just going from one thing with trade-offs to another thing with trade-offs. But actually, maybe coming full circle is a better way to think about it because like you pick things up on each revolution and you get smarter and you make progress. Right. And I gave a whole big talk on this recently called transitional apps because I feel like we've kind of got into this linguistic trap where we think about multi-page apps or MPAs and single-page apps, SPAs, as being these completely different approaches to building the web. Whereas actually all of the application frameworks today that people are using are converging on something that is a little bit more nuanced, which is something that's in between the multi-page app and the single-page app worlds. We are generating HTML, but in many cases, when you navigate within an application, once you're in the application and you click a link and go somewhere else, very often that navigation is going to happen client side in a way that is instantaneous and offline friendly and all of these other things. And so, yes, we are moving back to being more considerate about search engine optimization and progressive enhancement and all of those things. Not necessarily because like developers care more than they used to, but because the tooling just presents that as a default, and you have to actively opt out of doing the right thing with these modern frameworks. But we are also taking the sort of the promise of the single page app paradigm and preserving that. So this isn't a retrograde step. We're not going back to the 90s way of building apps. And we're also not going back to servers. We're going like all of our backend rendering logic is moving
Edge.
Either to like there's obviously a lot of interest in serverless, but also to the edge. Cloudflare workers and Vercel edge functions, and Netlify has edge handlers that I think are still in beta. Like this is where things are moving, and you can't use that for everything yet, but you can use it for an awful lot of stuff, and that is changing the trade-offs that have informed the decisions that people have taken up till now.
Yeah, well, I couldn't think of a better way to end the show. Seriously, that's like, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your contributions to the web. Thank you for like never being satisfied with the status quo. Like, thank you for questioning. Thank you for saying we can do this better, actually. Really, Rich, you've done a lot for the web, and I think, we're very lucky to have, I think, thinkers like you who are able to, I think, elevate the conversation and also be comfortable with maybe not being the popular kid right away, right? I think it's hard to disagree with a bunch of really smart people who've, kind of settled on some ideas and say like, actually, like, no, you know. So thank you, and I'm eager to learn more about Svelte. This next year, it's on my list of things that I'm willing to take my increasingly limited time to learn new things, so I'm very picky about what I learn, and Svelte is on there, so that's a big deal. It's a very big endorsement, Rich, so.
Well, thank you so much. That all really means a lot.
Yeah. And Amelia, thank you so much also for being my co-pilot, and, for your wonderful insights as always. That's it for this week, kids. We're really, hope everybody has a wonderful holiday season. We've got some really fun shows to wrap up the year and more stuff even planned for next year. So we hope to catch you in the ether somewhere, sometime, someplace. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. You can hear that, right? You can hear it now. So we had intro music. I'm gonna take us off YouTube. So I think that takes us off anyways. But